Hi everyone, we're on 4 o'clock UK time, 5 o'clock Europe time, and 11 a.m. New York time, I think. So we've got some people who have joined us already. I'll just give it a couple of minutes for some people to trickle in, and then we'll get stuck in. Okay, should we get going? Yeah, hi everyone who's joined us already, and I think we will have a few people watching us live on YouTube as well, so watch your mouth, Ian, we're live on YouTube. My name is Liam Duffy. I'm a strategic advisor for the Counter-Extremism Project. Counter-Extremism Project is an international policy organization formed to combat the growing threat from extremist ideologies. We have a presence in the UK, in Brussels, in Germany, in Berlin, and the original franchise in New York. And Ian and I are from the UK team. We've got a very special guest today. I'll introduce him in a second, but just to do a quick caveat about myself, I've been struck down by the flu today. Maybe you can hear it in my voice. And I know, Ian, you're a bit of an intellectual powerhouse, so I'm going to try my best to keep up with you in my lesser state.
Okay, that's enough redundancy built into you not doing very well. Let's get on with it.
Awesome. Yeah, Ian, have you got anything to say before I introduce our guest?
Just hello to those who've joined us, and I'm very, very pleased indeed to spend some time with Liam and Jakob, obviously in particular, who's written a barnstorming history of the subject of free expression from ancient Greeks to radicalized geeks, if you look at one end of the spectrum to the other. And I'm looking forward to getting into it with you, Jakob, and discussing how it connects with, as Liam has described, our fundamental purpose here, which is to look at ways to combat violent extremism across the world.
Great. So yeah, on that note, I'll introduce our guest. So he informs me that it's either Jakob or Jacob, which wasn't very helpful, but it's Jakob or Jacob Mchangama. He is the executive director and founder, I believe, of Justitia, Copenhagen-based human rights think tank. But the number one reason that we're speaking to him today is he is the author of a brand new book, Free Speech, A Global History from Socrates to Social Media, which has just very, very recently come out to UK markets. There you go with Ian flashing it, making it look like he's been taking notes. And it, I think, has already been called the best history of free speech ever written. So quite the raps. Jakob, if you could just very quickly say hello, and anything I've missed important in the introduction, feel free to tell us about yourself before we dive into the book.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've really looked forward to this conversation today. So I don't think you missed too much. So I'm ready to delve into it.
Okay, great. So I mean, we will obviously, we're the Counter-Extremism Project. We're going to talk about extremist ideologies, about propaganda narratives, and how liberal democracies can effectively counter them while protecting freedom of speech. But before we do that, before we zero in on that, let's talk about your book. As I mentioned, Free Speech, Global History from Socrates to Social Media. I won't ask you to describe your book, but what I will ask you is why right now, at this point in 2022, did you feel the need to publish this book? Is there something particular that's happening now where you feel, I mean, we can talk about things around the world, but let's try and keep it on kind of Western liberal democratic model. Why do Western liberal democracies need to pay attention and be reminded of this history right now?
Yeah, so I should say that, you know, I've worked on the book for years, so it's basically a shorter version of a 40+ episode podcast on the history of free speech that I've also done since 2017, called Clear and Present Danger: A History of Free Speech. But I think in a certain way, it is fortunate that it's published now, unfortunately, because from my perspective, free speech has been in decline even in liberal democracies for about over a decade. So even though we're still living in a golden age of free speech compared to previous generations, and you know, if you go back a century or 2 centuries, certainly, I would argue that the golden age is in decline. So even though we've never had better opportunities to speak across borders and access information, liberal democracies are increasingly adopting restrictive laws. So in the UK, you have your online harms bill, you have the Law Commission, which is recommending expanding laws against incitement to hatred. You have Germany's NetzDG, a law to counter hate speech and illegal speech online. The Digital Services Act trying to do the same thing at a European Union level. So very much the pattern and trajectory is one where liberal democracies have come to view free speech, especially in the era of social media, as a threat as much as a fundamental value when it comes to the relationship to democracy. So that's unfortunately the reason why I think this book is needed at this point in time.
I was going to say, I think like you've reeled off quite a few examples of speech restricting legislation in European countries, but I mean, also there's almost like this shows how much I've internalized some of this rhetoric myself. But you almost wince kind of saying the word, because it's almost, and your book talks about, it's not just about enshrining rights in constitutions, it's about a culture of free speech as well. And it seems that in our culture, freedom of speech has become very out of fashion, kind of synonymous with wanting to say hateful things about minorities, but even to the point where I've seen a lot recently where freedom of speech itself is being repositioned as like a right-wing talking point. So just wondering if you could say a little bit about that culture and that perception of freedom of speech and why that needs defending.
Yeah, I think that's one of the unfortunate, maybe especially in sort of the Anglosphere, if you like. So the UK, the US, and Canada, and maybe also Australia. There's a tendency, I think, among some to see free speech as something right-wing extremists will trot out as a thinly veiled excuse to pummel minorities and get protection against bigotry and racism. And that, I think, is a profoundly dangerous development and a complete misunderstanding of the history of free speech, because one of the central theses of my book is that free speech might be, the most powerful engine of human equality ever devised by humankind, and it has always been, the practice and principle has been the most powerful tool for the oppressed and minority groups, whether it's enslaved African Americans, those who were colonized by the British Empire, victims of apartheid in South Africa, women before they won the rights to vote, the LGBT community, and so on and so on. So the idea among a certain segment of liberal progressive opinion, sort of to abandon free speech in favor of an ideal of equality and dignity, I think is very dangerous, because as I see it, free speech and equal dignity are values that are mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive.
That's the thing you said a moment ago is quite the statement. It's what was it? It's the most important.
I think I really do believe that it's the most powerful engine of human equality ever devised. I don't know of a single group that has faced oppression, marginalization, and so on, that has not relied on activism, on speech, on appealing to others in order to improve their lot, in order to appeal to universal values of equality and tolerance. That to me just seems very well documented, and we can go into some of the details. And then you mentioned the idea of the culture of free speech, and I think that ultimately the culture of free speech is more important than the legal protection of free speech. So if you have a weak culture of free speech, sort of which again is based on a commitment to tolerance on the part of the general citizenry, if that breaks down, if tolerance breaks down, if you no longer think that it's worthwhile living in a society where you can be neighbors, spouses, colleagues, and compatriots, despite deep disagreements about political ideology or religion, then I think the laws will pretty soon reflect that intolerance. And we often praise or pummel, depending on perspective, the First Amendment, the American protection of free speech in their constitution, which is the most speech protective of any constitutional provision in the world. But if you scratch the surface a little bit and you go back in history, the wording has been the same since 1791. But throughout its history, the First Amendment has permitted extremely draconian restrictions on free speech, reflecting the fact that the culture of free speech in the US had not yet, been developed sufficiently to accept, someone agitating against American involvement in World War I, or in favor of racial equality, or in favor of rights of women, or in favor of equality of the LGBT community, and so on and so forth.
Can I just jump in here for a second? I want to take you back to something I've heard you say, just to make sure, Jakob, I'm clear about this. You've talked about free speech as a function of design a couple of times. Surely you would rather see it through the lens of very uncertain evolution, rather than something that was inspired and intelligently designed by any sort of force of history. And surely now we're in a process of devolution at the back end of the process, where we're seeing more and more authoritarianism supplant the institutions and the concepts and the culture of free expression that you've illustrated very well in your book, The Roots of.
Yeah, I think it's a mix, really. So I traced the origins of free and equal speech back to the Athenian democracy some 2,500 years ago, and the ancient Athenians had two overlapping concepts. One was Isagoria, which means equality of speech, which was political free speech, which was exercised in the assembly, and which meant that every freeborn male Athenian citizen, at least in principle, had a right to had a direct voice in public affairs, to discuss and vote on the laws that govern them. And then they had the concept of parousia, which means something like uninhibited speech, which was the broader culture of free speech, which allowed radical philosophy and science and comedy and theater and so on, and at the cultural sphere. And this was not something that was set down intricately in constitutions or in written down in individual rights the same way as when the Enlightenment came along and free speech was codified in constitutions in France and the US, for instance. But when we get into that era, I think there is a conscious design to try and safeguard free speech in constitutions. But as I argue, those constitutional protections are important, but ultimately, sort of the idea of tolerance is more crucial. I think that this idea that actually we benefit from knowing what our neighbors and our co-citizens think about things, and we benefit from settling our disagreements peacefully and amicably. In many ways, I think pragmatism and compromise are often very good values in a democratic society. But in order to be able to compromise and be pragmatic, you need to be able to discuss your disagreements and voice your view of things, and then you can make political compromises and be pragmatic in legislation. But so I think you need free speech radicalism in order to have a pragmatic society where you can compromise and be happy with that compromise. And in that sense, I really think that free speech is the antithesis of violence. It's incredible. There were ideas, religious ideas, for instance, if we go back 4 or 5 centuries, that would bitterly divide Europeans and that people would be willing to kill for, that we today find to be completely arcane. Christians, many mainline Christian sects thought that anti-Trinitarianism was about the worst heretical and blasphemous idea that anyone could voice, and anti-Trinitarians were viciously persecuted. If today someone was an anti-Trinitarian and they went to Speaker's Corner in London, you'd have to be extremely unlucky to find someone who would punch you in the face for voicing that, and very few people would even take notice. And I think that means that free speech also tends to accustom us to tolerance. So suddenly we find out that ideas that we thought were extremely dangerous and that were a threat to what today we'd call national security, in fact are not so dangerous once you allow them to be discussed in the open. And that's, I think, is a huge insight that we're missing currently.
So I was just going to say, can we step into the national security arena then, going from the general to the particular just for a moment, to give the example of the United Kingdom. So we're imprisoning what looks like an increasing number of often young men for relatively short periods of times for offences that relate to the glorification of terrorism or acts preparatory to an attack, often a significant way upstream of any violence. So I think you're qualified to help us with 2 questions that arise from that situation. Is prison a solution for the espousement of hateful ideologies? And if it isn't, is control of online access that mobilizes these people to violent extremism then a more proportionate response, and a response that's more in keeping with your central thesis about the protection of free expression at all costs almost?
Yeah, I think we need to hold 2 ideas in our heads at the same time, and that's very often very difficult for human beings. So on the one hand, I think every reasonable person will acknowledge that it is almost impossible to coordinate and arrange at least any large-scale terrorist attack or cultivate sort of violent ideology without using speech. You need speech to coordinate. You need speech to convince people to become so extreme that they're willing to kill innocents and commit to a radical ideology, whether secular or religious. And if you want to take it up to the larger scale, I don't think it would be impossible to coordinate a genocide without the use of speech. So you could take Rwanda as a quote unquote good example, where radio contributed to the mass slaughter over a very short time. hundreds of thousands of people. That said, and so, so if you accept that premise, and I think it would be foolish not to accept that premise, you can talk to jihadists and they'll tell you very different ways of how they became radicalized. Some of them watched news where they saw news of Muslims being killed in Syria, and that prompted them, or maybe they met someone on Twitter or Telegram or whatever, and they were convinced of the righteousness of their ideas. So if you accept that speech can lead to harms, then it becomes logical from the outset to say, well, then we just need to crack down on that speech. We need to punish people who engage in extreme speech, and we need to censor access to extremism. However, it does not necessarily follow that because speech can lead to harms, censorship and repression is an efficient it's an efficient remedy, and it does not follow that the uncertain benefits of such an approach will outweigh the unintended negative consequences downstream of such restriction and repression. And I use, and we can get back to discussing sort of contemporary 21st century jihadist and extreme right-wing violence, but I use the fall of the Weimar Republic as an example in the book. So of course the fall of the Weimar Republic, of the sort of fragile German democracy from 1918 to 1933, is one of the main reasons why European democracies are committed to what we can call militant democracy, sort of the idea that democracies must be intolerant of extreme intolerance and crack down on totalitarian hateful ideas, because the Nazis assumed power through democratic means, even if they never gained an outright majority. They had newspapers and so on. But when you look closer at the history of the Weimar Republic, you see that the Weimar Republic had far more speech restrictive laws than we do in most democracies today. So for instance, the radio was heavily censored. Communists and Nazis did not have access to the radio. German states had the right to administratively ban newspapers from being published for up to 8 weeks if they spread fake news or attacked government institutions or government personalities. And Joseph Goebbels, who would later become propaganda minister, bragged that his newspaper, Der Angriff, was the most frequently banned newspaper in Germany. So he used it basically as a propaganda platform, the repression. Julius Streicher, who was justifiably, I think, executed after World War II in the Nuremberg trials, the editor of Der Stürmer, a sickeningly anti-Semitic newspaper. In 1929, he was convicted for the second time for religious offense because he published these vicious blood libels to attack Jews. But he was celebrated by his supporters. And less than a year after his conviction in Nuremberg, the people of Nuremberg voted overwhelmingly in favor of the Nazis, increasing the share of the Nazis. And I think the most damning verdict against the idea that free speech, that restricting free speech is an efficient tool against totalitarian ideologies, is the fact that the Nazis used very provisions in the Weimar Republic that was supposed to protect democracy. They used that provision to abolish it. So when you had the Reichstag's fire, Adolf Hitler strong-armed President Hindenburg into signing a decree that suspended a number of civil liberties, including free speech, association, and assembly. And he used the Constitution, Article 48, an emergency measure of the Weimar Constitution, and that allowed him to crack down on socialists, on social democrats, with no due process, ban their newspapers, ram them into concentration camps, and then within 6 months he had created a totalitarian one-party state. So in many ways, the Nazis also used the existing restrictions of the Weimar Republic for their own purposes once they had gained power. And again, I'm not arguing that censorship and repression explains the collapse of the Weimar Republic or the rise of Nazism. Right. But that's a very reductionist lens. There were many other and more important factors at play. However, I think that in open democracies, if you want to argue that restricting free speech is the way forward, I think the burden of proof should be on those who want to restrict free speech that it's an efficient and proportionate measure that will actually work. And I don't think the Weimar Republic supports that argument.
There's just before I go on to another question, there's just like that. The thing I always keep coming back to is, as the example you gave about how the Weimar Republic's own legislation was weaponized against it when the Nazis came to power, is, you might support restrictions on free speech now when your kind of political tribe is the one holding most of the power, but don't assume that will always be the case and they won't be used against you in the future. But just like I do want to stick on, combating extremism and terrorism, but I'm fascinated by this idea of free speech culture. So if I can just pick up on a couple of things you said a minute ago as well, we talked about in the United States as having the First Amendment, but also the United States right now strikes me as an example of where that free speech culture is probably under attack more than actually many other Western democracies. And I think you talked about why wouldn't we want to live in a society where we can have deep disagreements with our neighbors? And it's kind of a two-pronged question. The first part is about, I've seen the way that, political activists, mostly on the progressive left and liberal left, would kind of completely reject that framing, because there's an increasing, and it comes back to the examples you've been using, there's an increasing labeling of domestic political opponents as Nazis, as white supremacists, as fascists, as extremists, as terrorists. So if by you saying compromise to their ears, that is, you're asking, if that's the Republican Party, for example, you're asking us to compromise with fascists, you're asking us to compromise with white supremacists, and that's the kind of argument that's used. And I think most people agree that actually, that's not something that you want to do. So that's the kind of way that argument is used. Sorry, this is a long-winded question, but I was fascinated by the way you framed this.
I think you're right. I think the culture of free speech in the US is under. I wouldn't say it's not unraveling, because if you look at American attitudes to free speech, it's still in the top globally, but certainly there are signs that it's sort of fraying around the edges
and around key institutions which hold a lot of the power,
and cultural institutions, universities, media institutions, and that actually live off free speech. And so on the one hand, you could say, and this is generalizing again, so people on the progressive liberal left who have no problem with what is labeled cancel culture and reject that term and say, it's fine to have consequences for speech, and as long as the state doesn't punish you. Of course, what you will often see, a lot of Republicans talk a big game about the pernicious effects of cancel culture, but are perfectly happy to engage in it themselves. When it's people speaking at universities and so on, that with ideas that they don't like. But
Jakob, can I just jump in there, because you cite in the book in defense of your argument, 156 laws passed in Republican legislatures in various ways to restrict free speech. So this is clearly a problem that transcends the political access.
And I think it's worse now. So if you go to PEN America, they have a great database of what they call educational gag orders. So you see this tsunami of bills passed in Republican-dominated legislatures targeting so-called divisive concepts on education and race and gender, not only in K-12, in some instances also colleges and universities and public institutions. And they are sort of the mirror image, the distorted mirror image, if you like, of progressive liberal hate speech codes. That sometimes the wording is uncomfortably identical, in the same way that in the same way that white Southern slave owners would use sort of the language of complain about hate speech when they were confronted by abolitionists in the 1830s. So we see how arguments in favor of restricting free speech can often unite ideological enemies when they target whatever they don't like. So you're absolutely right that there's also a huge amount of intolerance on the Republican conservative side, and they're actually trying to use state institutions, whereas a lot of the developments on the progressive left tend to use cultural institutions and attempts to cancel or deplatform speakers, which is not protected by the First Amendment, and that's why some can argue, well, this has nothing to do with free speech because the First Amendment only protects against state action. But I think that's a misunderstanding of free speech. If you go to John Stuart Mill, for instance, in On Liberty, he says very clearly, he argues that protection against the tyranny of the magistrate is not enough. You also need protection against the tyranny of society's tendency to impose its views on dissenters. You see the same in Alexis de Tocqueville. You see the same in George Orwell, and it goes all the way back to the Athenian democracy. And it's sort of picture of tolerance among citizens, mostly male citizens.
Yeah, can we? I know Liam quite rightly wants to pull this back to violent extremism. Can we just stick with J.S. Mill for a second, because you're clearly a fan. He's got multiple mentions in your book, and I wonder what you've got to say about his conception of the word harm. I think it would be unrecognizable to him now. For example, having students demanding the right routinely to be protected from views they don't like for fear of being triggered, or perceiving actual violence being visited upon them by mere words. So you talked about Weimar, and I think there is something really important here about what we say and how we govern our decaying institutions. I'm afraid I would say in relation to protections against free speech, to recalibrate their approach to free expression from, and I may be borrowing from your language here, a kind of authoritarian activist model back to Mill's strictly limited concept of interference. The state interferes only in very limited circumstances with your right to express yourself. So what are we going to do with these institutions to give them some resilience? Because actually, I think what we see in the UK in relation, and I would say this, it's probably contentious, but in relation to combating violent extremism in particular, the threat posed by Islamist extremism, which is by far and away the most potent threat we face, the body count doesn't lie, etc. A kind of supine, cringing refusal to deal with the problem in front of them, and a kind of lack of almost of moral character to want to confront head on hateful and toxic ideologies that are antithetical to the ideas of a liberal democracy that we seem almost embarrassed in this country to talk about. So what are we going to do with those institutions to reverse this decay?
Yeah, well, I'm not that familiar with the situation in British universities when it comes to these issues, but I would say more broadly, I think we need to get back to basics when it comes. Ultimately, you cannot imagine universities without academic freedom, which again is a subspecies of freedom of expression more generally. So I think we need. It's difficult to legislate around these issues, but quite clearly we need brave leaders and managers and so on that are willing to stand up against whatever fads pull them away from the central core mission of universities and the values that support that. But I guess it also is important to have a demand for free speech by students themselves. If students do not demand free speech, but demand restrictions on their own free speech, or at least on the ones that they they don't like, then we have a problem. And this, again, I don't think this is something that can be legislated. It's basically as so many other things, it's something that needs to a debate that needs to be won, where we have to convince our fellow human beings of the goods. And I think one way to do it is to sort of avoid the culture war style debates over free speech, where you sort of attack people who are concerned about racist ideas as these social justice warrior snowflakes. I think that will be, you will only antagonize such people. So you have to try and appeal to them with arguments showing that the concerns that they have about racism, about discrimination, and about intolerance, that they are not likely, they are actually likely to get worse if you restrict free speech, and that free speech has been absolutely instrumental for the undoubted and undeniable progress that has been made when it comes to equality and tolerance and so on in the Western world. But it's going to be a long. I think it's going to be a long struggle, but one that cannot be ceded.
I'm not going to lie to you. I'm skeptical that argument would work. I mean, are you familiar with like John McWhorter and Wes Yang and people like that? And yeah. I mean, John McWhorter's book, the thrust of it was actually like this kind of the modern, whether you want to call it social justice warriors or whatever, this kind of modern progressive ideology that Wes Yang would call the successor ideology. It kind of has this almost religious character to it. So you talked about how like a few centuries ago, if you were attacking Christianity's sacred cows, for want of a better word, then you could find yourself in a bit of a fix. But now, like to what extent is this a reflection of society's sacred cows changing, where like that the kind of increasing dominance of that, what Wes Yang calls the successor ideology, means that there are certain things that you just simply can't criticize because those are the new, there is a religious character to this.
I think it might be, but it might be, but I still think there's a critical core of people who certainly can be reached by these arguments, and I think that once you challenge the sort of the hardcore illiberal opponents of classical ideas of free speech, their sort of grip and power will be challenged, and because I think in some, I think a lot of people who might ape their ideas are not necessarily deeply convinced about the rigorousness of these ideas. But you often see that extremists can dominate. A small group of vocal extremists can dominate others who then fear because they think that they're afraid to challenge the new orthodoxy. But orthodoxies can be challenged successfully. We've seen that throughout history. So I don't think there's any alternative, to doing that. And I certainly see a lot of institutions, civil society organizations, and others who are actively engaging in this battle of ideas.
Sounds like you're more optimistic than I am. Sorry, I'm gonna drag this right back to what we actually wanted to talk about, because I think I keep dragging it away just because I'm interested in the culture part. So you mentioned about how it's not just protection from the state. I think in state encroachments onto freedom of speech or civil liberties in general, I think increasingly what we're seeing is actually like an outsourcing of a lot of censorship to tech companies in particular. And I mean, this is going to sound ironic coming from, we're sitting here doing this for an event called the Extremism Project for the organization, but there's a lot of self-styled extremism experts and NGOs that now are cropping up and like coming out with justifications in the press or reports about why certain pieces of information need to be like knocked offline. And and you know, now it's not just about extremism, it's about misinformation, it's about hate, it's about harm. These are like very broad and subjective terms. And actually what's really stood out to me in your book was how, if you look at the last 2 centuries, a lot of the attacks on free speech from like authoritarian or totalitarian governments or movements have used a lot of the same words almost. Like Leninist Russia was wanting to combat false information and wanted to have legislate against hate and things like that. And it just seems like we're repeating all of that, but it's not coming from the state this time, or at least it's being outsourced.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's being outsourced, and one of the reasons, you know, is that we've gone from the internet being this very decentralized, horizontal information sphere where no one really had strong central authority, to a much more centralized and vertical internet with a few platforms that really dominate. And so governments have, of course, found out that if you can strong arm certain platforms to remove content, then there are alternatives. But if you remove something successfully from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, then at least sort of it'll be away from the mainstream, and then you might have to resort to sort of Telegram or the likes. And then we also see a lot of NGOs, as you rightly said, and civil society organizations who see it as a measure of success of being able to purge content that they deem to be disinformation and so on. And there's a whole cottage industry sprung up. Now, I think part of it is really necessary. It's a good thing that we have people who pore over Russian disinformation and try to debunk it and so on. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, a lot of organizations see it as, as success when they manage to be able to influence the definitions of hate and disinformation and have content removed. And I think that what we're lacking also, again, is any sort of empirical data suggesting that this is an efficient way forward. So, obviously, we're still in the very early stages of understanding social media and what it does to democracy. But I would, and maybe this is just my confirmation bias as part of my research, but a lot of the information out there, the empirical data, does not necessarily suggest that censorship and repression of information is an effective cure. It can actually, in many ways, be counterproductive. So I used a study, for instance, that looks on the preventive effect of free speech on terrorist attacks, where you see a very strong and robust correlation, and the author sort of argues that it's a mix of both, law enforcement being able to actually identify threats, but also this idea, the pressure cooker thesis, that if you repress views, that it will then be easier for someone to justify using violence. And in fact, there's a brand new study from 2022 which says, finds that there's a positive association between perceived levels of repression and intentions to engage in anti-governmental violence. A study of European right-wing violence finds that the violence is partly fueled by extensive public repression of radical right actors and opinions. So in many ways, these repressive policies might actually be counterproductive and be more about society's need to take a strong stand and show that this is unacceptable and this is something that we're doing something about. It's very difficult in the aftermath of a terrorist campaign to have a government, a responsible minister go on TV and say, well, it's important for us to tolerate even extreme views that led to these heinous attacks, because otherwise the effects might actually be worse. You would be crucified in the press and by your voters, because it's just not emotionally satisfying for human beings to tolerate.
Jakob, can I just jump in there?
Yeah.
And just because we are dealing with abstractions, and we're also, I think, in danger of suggesting that the minister who would stand up and say turn the other cheek is in some way morally superior to those people who are directly affected by violent extremism in the most appalling and visceral ways. And I just want to take you to a case that you've cited in some research that I've read of yours, and it was a cartoonist who was praising the 9/11 attacks, being convicted in France of glorification of terror offences, and that conviction being, I think, upheld by the European Court of Human Rights, which found on appeal that it seemed to be consistent with the protection of freedom of expression in the convention. And you were very worried about, I suppose, what you would call this judicial activism. But is it, though, realistic simply to have a response? I don't want to caricature what you've said, but what I'm hearing is a response to offensive material and behavior now much worse than what it was 20 years ago, and on steroids because of social media. That is essentially, in relation to this particular example, well, just don't buy the newspaper. I mean, could you not argue that simply letting such hateful conduct, which I think you would suggest either prosper or fail in the marketplace of ideas, show not strength and pragmatism, but actually impotence?
I think it could be characterized as such, but the fact that you don't resort to censorship and repression of specific expressions does not mean that you can't do a host of other things as a government. For instance, if someone expresses extremist ideas, it might be a very good idea for law enforcement to put them under surveillance. And of course, a government can do all kinds of other things to try and counter extremism. So I wouldn't see it as incompetence, and I certainly wouldn't say that, oh, turn the other cheek against jihadists or others. And I also think, of course, when you explicitly incite violence, that's something that no society should tolerate. So I can certainly see why it would be characterized as such, but I don't think that is necessarily the case. And I've actually, some of some of the strongest examples I've seen of how extremists have been converted to democratic ideas. So one, I'm sure you're familiar with Hizb ut-Tahrir, this extremist, formerly nonviolent Islamist organization that wants to build a global caliphate. And so because they're also very anti-Semitic, a lot of people want them to be banned, and people and politicians in Denmark wanted to have them banned. And so I wrote a piece saying, we shouldn't ban them because we would compromise our freedoms and so on. And so shortly after, I received a message from one of the leading members of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Denmark, and he said he'd read my piece, and it had made him drop out of Hizb ut-Tahrir. He said he suddenly realized that the ideas that he were espousing were deeply wrong, and the only way that he, as a minority, could live in peace in a country like Denmark was because he enjoyed religious freedom of expression, and so on. And so he left Hizb ut-Tahrir. And there's a very powerful video by someone I'm sure Shiraz Maher in the UK, who also used to be Hizb ut-Tahrir, and he talks about how he's standing in London outside the embassy of Uzbekistan. He's standing with these black flags of Hizb ut-Tahrir, protesting against how the government of Uzbekistan apparently is violating the rights of Muslims there. And then suddenly it just dawns on him, I'm standing here in London. I'm a member of an organization where if we were in power, no one would be allowed to protest, our ideas, our government. No one would be allowed to stand with the Union Jack or other flags. I'm enjoying all these freedoms. They're what and how can I possibly be advocating these ideas? Then he became a very prominent anti-radicalization expert, and that you can go on Oslo Freedom Forum as YouTube page and watch Shiraz's testimony, and I think it's incredibly powerful. I think that says a lot about the power of ideas, and I think that also is just a testament to the vitality and vibrancy of the idea of free speech.
I mean, unfortunately, we don't have too many of those Damascene conversions, and that's part of the problem. Is dealing with people who are ideologically bulletproof and how you manage the risk of their harm and so on. If I may, and I know time's against us, and I try to be succinct here, but I wanted to take you back to something that we haven't really addressed properly, and that is this consensus. And you mentioned it earlier in your question, which is why I want to take you up on it, that incitement to violence is somehow across that red line, and it's it's a very useful demarcation between that and everything else that we ought to try to protect. But I'm still a bit worried about that, because it comes back to what we've been talking about, how ideas prosper and survive and get countered on the public square. If you push people out of that square who are inciting violence, that is not job done. I'm sure you'd agree with me. Sure. Because, if we stop talking to or about people that the really spooky people, frankly, who really want to harm us and hurt us and have brought enormous destruction and grief and horror across Europe, those conversations don't go away. So if we push them out of the public square, you mentioned Telegram and so on, they will survive and prosper in places that we can't see and that we have no access to and that we can't easily construct counter narratives to combat. So what's the solution to that?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a solution as such. I just think that, if you're engaging in incitement to direct terrorism, for instance, then that is something that I think should be punished in the same way that people should be punished and were punished for radio programs calling for genocide in Rwanda, because basically there you're not engaging in debate. You're not trying to convince people. You're actually trying to kill people, and I think that's universally a red line. But I'm under no illusion that this will be an effective remedy. It won't change minds of those people. But once you're willing to cross a line from saying sort of glorifying terrorism or having extreme ideologies advocating for a caliphate, and then saying to someone, well, go and blow yourself up on Tower Bridge, that I think is a red line.
I think just as Ian said, as time's against us, if people in the audience do have questions, you can type them in the chat. We'll ask you one last question, I think. And just while you're answering that, we can hopefully get some questions filtering through, and we can use the last few minutes to look at those, if that's okay. I did want to get to, we've talked a lot about tech companies and state responses to extremism and terrorism, but the other free speech spectral threat that is hanging over Europe in particular, I guess, is the kind of spate of blasphemy or alleged blasphemy killings and murders that have kind of followed all over the world, actually, since the Salman Rushdie affair. And obviously, I think your book touches on the Jyllands-Posten affair, which Denmark found itself at the center of, and then there was obviously Charlie Hebdo and Samuel Paty more recently. So I guess if you could just say a little word about that, to my mind, that looks like that campaign has been successful, that to silence people on that topic. But also there seems to be quite a lot of confusion in kind of right-thinking circles about the response to that. A little kind of moral confusion about who's in the right and who's in the wrong. There's always an eruption of debate after that, when it seems to me a pretty clear-cut issue. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that while we get some questions come through.
Sure. In fact, the whole reason why I became obsessed with free speech is because of the Jyllands-Posten affair, because Denmark, like most other Danes, just took free speech for granted until 30th of September 2005, where these cartoons were published, and then over the following months, it became sort of a global battle of values between the relationship of religion and free speech, sort of in a manner where you'd have thought that in our part of the world that had been settled by the Enlightenment, and then suddenly you had people arguing that this was actually an abuse of free speech and punching down on a vulnerable minority, and unfortunately there are still people living with around-the-clock security, and the reason why Charlie Hebdo was attacked was that they were one of the few Western magazines that actually showed solidarity with Jyllands-Posten and republished the cartoons, and Samuel Paty was beheaded by someone enforcing what I call the jihadist veto, because he showed these cartoons in a class as part of teaching his pupils about free expression. However, I don't know that the debate has been lost as such. So, for instance, so after the cartoons, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Muslim majority countries, some 57, I think, engaged in a sort of double down on a campaign to have blasphemy or defamation of religion or defamation of Islam banned as part of human rights law at the United Nations. And for a number of years, they won, they were able to pass resolutions in the General Assembly and Human Rights Council. But then in 2011, the US and Europe sort of successfully won the campaign against that, and the OIC had to drop their campaign for a global blasphemy ban. In Denmark, probably my biggest public policy success so far was that I was very directly involved in 2017 in having our blasphemy ban in Denmark repealed when no one had been charged in 1971, and then suddenly a guy with 10 followers on YouTube was being charged for burning a Quran, and then that was resented by a lot of people. So and I think in France, I think whatever else you think about Emmanuel Macron, who has definitely not always been great on free speech, I think he's been very, very clear about the importance of free speech in the sphere of religion. What is true, though, is that fear very much remains alive. So very, very few Danish newspapers would publish the cartoons, but most of them by now have sort of given up the weaselly arguments and just admit that it's out of fear. And I think that's a good first step, admitting that you're self-censoring out of fear and not sort of trying to say, oh, we do that because we don't want to offend people. So again, I don't think the battle has been lost. I don't think that the jihadist veto will win in the West.
Okay, I mean, fairly optimistic note. So let's see if you're optimistic to one of the audience questions that we've had come through. So Belinda is asking about where do you see the relationship between government regulation on freedom of speech and large social media platforms in the next 10 years, or more in general, how do you see modern societies navigating this question 10 years from now? And I guess, I mean, this is another thing about history repeating itself. I noticed in your book is like a lot of the panic about social media seems resonant of some of the panic about the printing press or other technological advances. Anytime a gatekeeper loses that gatekeeping function, we seem to have these kind of panics about disinformation and stuff like that. So give us a sense of the next 10 years, how this might be navigated.
It's a good question. I think the trend in terms of legislation is very, I'm quite negative about the direction we're headed. However, I think that there might be technological workarounds. So I think that a more decentralized social media ecosystem would make it much more difficult with centralized content moderation, government mandated content moderation. And I think there are also ways where the industry could help could help sort of dodge the constant attacks by governments. For instance, I think if users were given much more control over content, I think that could be a useful tool. So, for instance, the definition of anti-Semitism varies. There are some people who think that denial of Holocaust should be, it's banned in some countries, it's not banned in others. In some countries, calling for boycotts of Israel is banned. In other countries, it isn't. So how should Facebook regulate it? Should they adopt the maximalist definition of anti-Semitism, or one that is more in line with free speech standards? Now, if a third party, sort of a Jewish rights organization, were to be able to develop a filter that people could individually flick on and off, that had a more maximalist definition of anti-Semitism, that would then make it, then we wouldn't have to have a centralized content moderation that pushes us towards the lowest common denominator. You could have the same thing with misogyny and various other controversial issues, and then the centralized content moderation by the platforms could be limited to the worst of the worst. I think that would be sort of a more Solomonic solution. But again, we might also, hopefully, I think, see more and smaller platforms develop that will sort of upend the current business model. And then, we might not talk about social media and free speech in the same terms that we do today, where we have these massive centralized platforms.
It seems to me that when like rival platforms do seem to emerge, or anyone with a platform really seems to emerge, it seems there's a bit of a concerted effort to knock that thing or that person offline. And often, actually, given that we're here talking about this, often extremism or disinformation or misinformation concerns are the ones that are cited for doing that. But obviously,
Sure.
Tech companies are going to be very happy to crush one of their rivals and give it a noble reason, right?
Sure, but these are still early days. Let's not forget that these social Facebook is less than 20 years old. So in the grand scheme of things, it's a relatively recent platform. So who knows? I might be overly optimistic, but I just think it's technology and innovation would be preferable to the current trajectory of laws, because it's difficult to see where it ends when you have this constant scope creep of prohibited content online, and where every sort of civil society organization sort of creates this race to the gutter of trying to have people deplatformed and more content banned.
I mean, I'm attracted to the fix that you've described of giving the user more autonomy and more choice over filtering content. But of course, that leaves the problem of what else is out there and who else might be attracted to it. In terms of your concept, often the worst people, in terms of their vulnerability and suggestibility, attracted to the worst ideas if there's no control at all except from the end user.
No, but I think this was more of a Solomonic losing. So one way you could say is that, so the big platforms would say, okay, we draw the limit we would be inspired by international human rights standards to where we draw the limit on disinformation and hate speech, for instance. That would be significantly more speech protective than what follows under their current terms. And then for the rest, that which is awful but lawful, we let the users decide. I think that could be a workable compromise until two teenagers working out of a garage in Silicon Valley upend everything with innovation.
I'm a big believer in keeping the ratio of complaints made to solutions offered 1 to 1, and I think I've made the complaints and you've offered the solutions, so that's worked out pretty well. I think we did have a question about things like attacks on Israel and stuff like that are outlawed or boycott, of course, for boycotts, but I think you kind of covered that, and you do cover that in your book as well. So for want of, I don't see any other questions coming through, we can start wrapping up, unless Ian, you've got any final thoughts.
No, I don't, and I'm going to leave it to you to wrap up, Liam. Thank you.
I'm going to leave it to Jakob to wrap up then. Jakob, have you got any final thoughts that you didn't get off your chest that you want to give us before we go?
Buy the bloody book.
Ian, show us the book.
No, it's
on Amazon, not expensive. I'm very good.
No, it's been a real pleasure and a privilege. I think time has really flown by. We could easily have spent a couple of hours more, but I hope to stay in touch. And if there's anyone watching this and they have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me on via email or social media, and I'll be happy to try and answer any questions.
Awesome. Well, yeah, you've answered all of our questions and comments and complaints, and very eloquently, and really, really glad we got you, because I know, as we said before, you've been prolific out there talking and singing the praises of free speech, and I certainly am with you, I think, on this. I didn't need much convincing, but I'm convinced. So so thanks for your time, and I'm sure we'll be in touch again. And thank you so much to everybody who joined us. And this will be available on YouTube pretty much instantaneously. If you want to send this to any friends or colleagues, we would massively appreciate that, because that bumps us up in the algorithm. Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
thanks,
cheers,
guys.
Ian.
Yeah,
Bye.
great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks so much.